Bulger is dead.
A chilling, violent end to a murderous life.
I hope it was a brutal murder instead of a natural cause.
A force of evil who created a reign of terror.
But that guy put my family through hell and back.
Ruling the Boston underworld.
Thank God.
And orchestrating countless cold-blooded killings.
What did Whitey do to your family?
Destroyed it.
Notorious gangster James Whitey Bulger killed behind bars.
The world is a much better place and a safer place with no Whitey Bulger in it.
Infamous South Boston mobster Whitey Bulger is dead. Hello everyone, I'm Mark Ockerbloom.
And I'm Vanessa Welch. The criminal turned FBI informant who was captured after 16 years on the run was found dead this morning in a federal prison in West Virginia. He was 89 years old.
The U.S. Department of Justice confirmed reports Bulger had been found dead, and a source says it is being investigated as a homicide. We have team coverage now on the man who terrorized communities in Massachusetts and around the country. We begin with Bob Ward, who has been covering Whitey Bulger for years. His crimes, convictions, and now, final justice.
Right to the end, James Bulger always denied he was an FBI informant. But now an FBI investigation is underway to determine if Whitey Bulger died a rat's death, the victim of a mob hit behind bars. James Bulger was found dead Tuesday morning at West Virginia's Hazleton Federal Prison, a maximum security facility. Bulger arrived there just hours before and placed in general population with other inmates. In 2013, Bulger was convicted in a landmark mob trial which included 11 murders. In the years Bulger was a fugitive, many of his closest criminal associates cut deals with the feds and testified against him. One of them, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, told the jury he and Whitey routinely traded information with federal investigators while Bulger and Flemmi built their criminal empire. It's a revelation that could get any criminal killed. The feds are not saying how Bulger died. At 89 years old, the aging mobster was in failing health. But the questions linger. Just this year, Stephen Flemmi testified against former New England mob boss Frank Salemi in the murder trial of Boston nightclub owner Stephen DeSaro. Salemi and co-defendant Paul Wiedek were both convicted in the case. Paul Wiedek right now is an inmate at the same prison where Whitey Bulger was found dead. It is likely the feds will be looking to see if that is a coincidence or if someone else targeted Bulger for death. Meantime, Whitey Bulger's own family probably has its own questions. We caught up with Jackie Bulger, Whitey's brother, and he told us this.
I have no idea. That's the first I heard of it. I heard he wasn't feeling good a while back. That's how I heard. I don't have anything to say right now.
I'm Bob Ward, Boston 25 News.
Bulger's life of crime began in South Boston. He vanished in 1994.
16 years later, he would finally be taken into custody some 3,000 miles away in Santa Monica, California.
For most of us, this was our first glimpse of the elusive South Boston mob boss James Whitey Bulger. And it was a moment few of us ever thought we would see. This is Whitey Bulger in Federal Prison Orange, escorted under heavy guard on his way to a federal court hearing in Boston. The man who was once the most feared name in Boston's underworld, now reduced to a perp walk. James Bulger was born September 3, 1929 in Dorchester. He was one of 6 children in a Roman Catholic family and grew up in the South Boston projects. At the age of 14, Bulger had his first brush with the law, arrested and setting up a lifetime of being on the wrong side of the law. Before that side of his life, Bulger served in the United States Air Force. He received an honorable discharge in 1952, and that's when it all turned into a life of crime. There were arrests for bank robberies and other crimes, a stint in a federal pen where Bulger volunteered for an LSD experiment in return for an early release. Bulger did time in Alcatraz, America's future most wanted fugitive, housed in America's most notorious prison. Finally, in 1965, James Bulger returned to the Boston area and inserted himself as a member of the Winter Hill Gang directly into what's become known as the deadly Irish Gang Wars. Bulger eventually took over the Winter Hill Gang in Somerville from Howie Winter. And that's when Bulger and his cohort, Stephen Flemmi, moved their headquarters from Somerville to Lancaster Street in the North End. And that's where the state police shot this infamous surveillance video. And that very location brought the Bulger gang close to the Italian mob's North End turf of the Angiulo family. And soon enough, Bulger and Flemmi, according to court proceedings, became secret FBI informants. Their handler was FBI agent John Connolly. It was an unusual relationship between an FBI operative and his informants and turned criminal. Connolly was convicted in 2002 on racketeering charges stemming from his relationship with Bulger. The DEA started to put the heat on Bulger, and that's when Whitey started living his life as a fugitive from justice. Along for the ride, his longtime girlfriend, Teresa Stanley. But Stanley didn't last long. She wanted to go back with her kids. Enter Catherine Gregg, 20 years younger than Bulger, and had plenty of history with him, believed to be his lover while he was with Stanley. Nobody knew where they were. There were plenty of guesses, plenty of sightings. For 16 years, the couple somehow, though, eluded authorities. Whitey on the FBI's most wanted list the entire time, with $1 million bounty on his head.
This is an announcement by the FBI.
And then, the unbelievable. A PSA was released by the same agency that cut a deal with Whitey. The FBI, focusing on Catherine Gregg, thought if someone recognized her, or if somehow she got word that would lead them to Whitey. And they were right. It did. But not in the States. In Iceland, a woman who used to live in Santa Monica, California, recognized Catherine Gregg. The FBI says she contacted them from her new home in Iceland. And the rest is history. An alleged mobster from South Boston, sitting on the FBI's most wanted list for so many years, found living in California in a tiny apartment under the names Charles and Carol Gasco, controlling his environment, his girlfriend, his world, until the FBI was able to lure him out of his apartment under a ruse and went in for the arrest. The date, June 22nd, 2011. Back home, in that orange jumpsuit, where he's accused of unspeakable crimes, Gregg, convicted, sentenced to prison for 8 years after pleading guilty to conspiracy to harboring a fugitive, to identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity fraud. Bulger sat at the Plymouth County Courthouse of Correction, awaiting trial for his crimes. That trial started in June of 2013. He faced 32 counts of racketeering, money laundering, extortion, and weapons charges, including complicity in 19 murders. August 12, 2013, Whitey Bulger was found guilty on 31 counts, including both racketeering charges, and was found to have been involved in 11 murders. Bulger was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years for his crimes. Bulger's assets were auctioned off in June of 2016, raising $109,000 for his victims. Bulger's life of crime even caught the attention of Hollywood. The character of Frank Costello, played by Jack Nicholson in the 2006 Martin Scorsese film The Departed, is loosely based on Whitey.
When did you get out of Alcatraz?
And Johnny Depp took on the role as the mob boss in the film Black Mass. Whitey Bulger was found dead October 30th in federal prison in West Virginia. He was 89 years old.
Bulger was found dead inside the federal prison early in the morning. He was transferred there. The center of this investigation is now happening inside that maximum security prison in West Virginia. USP Hazleton is located in Brewston Mills, right on the border of Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half south of Pittsburgh.
Whitey Bulger lasted less than 24 hours after being transferred to that high-security prison in West Virginia. Investigative reporter Eric Rasmussen found out Bulger is the 3rd prisoner killed at that facility just this year. Correction officers at USP Hazleton say it's not just a string of bad luck. For years, they've been complaining about not having enough guards to watch over the prison's more than 1,200 inmates, including its latest arrival, Whitey Bulger.
About 80 miles south of Pittsburgh, inmates call the federal prison at Hazleton Misery Mountain. Whitey Bulger, the latest to experience that misery before his death. The Corrections Union told 25 Investigates Bulger was in general population at Hazleton, which is also home to other inmates with ties to organized crime.
From what I understand, it was a murder. This is a very violent facility, and always has been.
Rick Heldreth is the president of the union representing corrections officers at Hazleton. He and others have been complaining about understaffing at the high-security prison for years. Heldreth says they're down about 40 officers, and the team that responds to medical emergencies is operating at 60%.
You can't ever stop all the violence at a facility, but the more staff you have, the more people you have walking around, the higher the chance that you'll have staff interrupt a situation in progress or stop violence from happening. I think it is a failure of the system. If any inmate is sentenced to a certain term of imprisonment and they end up facing something more than that.
Before Whitey Bulger's death, 27-year-old inmate Demario Porter was killed in a fight at the prison in September. In April, another fight ended with the death of 48-year-old Ian Thorne. Some lawmakers are now calling for an investigation into whether those deaths could have been prevented. Eric Rasmussen, Boston 25 News.
Earlier this month, D.C. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton called on the DOJ's Inspector General to open an investigation into the conditions at Hazleton. The IG's office offered no comment today when we called to ask whether it does plan to investigate.
Whitey left a long legacy in South Boston, and there, Boston 25 News reporter Catherine Burcham found some with mixed feelings about his death, including his control of one liquor store, where he tried to exercise control over much of the alcohol trade in Southie.
He was a criminal genius.
Whitey Bulger still casts a long shadow over his former home.
He did what he had to do to survive.
From the people who grew up with him and still remember when he took over this liquor store.
Next day, they told us we can't hang it. So we had to go in there. Because he didn't like the way we're all in the corner. It brought heat down on him. You know, he didn't like heat.
While some still say Whitey kept order in Southie.
All I can say, when he was here, everything was going all right. But ups and downs.
Others rejoiced at the news of his death inside a West Virginia prison.
People around here would like to sit in jail a little longer and not die.
Many noting not only his murderous past, but his work with the FBI.
It is what it is, I guess. You usually get what you get coming to you, you know?
I'm surprised it took that long, to be honest with you.
And why do you say that?
You've ratted out a lot of people. I'm surprised it wasn't earlier, that's all.
Catherine Burcham, Boston 25 News.
Some people Catherine spoke with said they feel sorrow for Whitey's family, saying even those who are evil have loved ones.
One of the family members of one of Whitey's alleged victims is speaking out. Stephen Davis's sister Deborah was brutally strangled, allegedly at the hands of Whitey and his partner Steve Fleming. Boston 25 News reporter Heather Hedges spoke with Davis. He says it feels like he's finally getting a little bit of justice for his sister.
You may remember at the conclusion of Whitey Bulger's trial in 2013, the jury issued a no finding in the strangulation death of Deborah Davis. But now her brother Stevie says this feels as close to justice as possible.
He hurt people deeply, you know, fathers, sisters, brothers.
Whitey Bulger hurt a lot of people, and that includes Steve Davis, who says he struggles with the death of his sister Deborah every day. In 1981, the 26-year-old was allegedly strangled at the hands of Whitey and his partner, Stephen the Rifleman Fleming. Davis says it destroyed his family. Some of his family members didn't know how to deal with it and the publicity that came with it. I asked Davis what it's like constantly having to hear about the man who allegedly murdered his sister.
It's like a canker sore, for Christ's sake, something that, you know, you're waiting for it to go away, you know, it's just, and then finally, days here. And
when Davis got the call about what happened, he says his initial reaction was relief.
I hope it was a brutal murder instead of a natural cause, and I hope all the families and everybody else are looking at this as a positive and a close for them.
And while we wait now to hear the details of Whitey's death, Davis says he knows in his gut what happened.
If it was a murder, was that justice for Deborah?
It would be justice for her and all of us, I think. You know, and to go out naturally, it's just not something that should be written in the book.
Davis also thinks it takes a particularly evil person to murder women. Whitey was convicted of strangling another woman, Deborah Hussey, the daughter of Steve Fleming's girlfriend. As for Davis, he's now working with a documentary filmmaker to tell the story of Whitey's trial. I'm Heather Hedges, Boston 25 News.
If there's anyone who knows Bulger's ruthless and criminal history in Boston, it's Mass State Police Trooper Bob Long, who was part of an investigative team that took this video while tracking him in the 80s. Long later testified at Bulger's federal trial. As Boston 25 News reporter Jessica Rea tells us, news of Whitey's death came as a big relief for this former trooper.
This is Whitey Bulger here.
The story of former state trooper Bobby Long and James Whitey Bulger began here, inside a garage on Lancaster Street 38 years ago.
That's Montero's father counting money.
This is where Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang ran their operation. Long was part of a state police investigative team tracking them. He and his team shot this video back then over the course of a year and a half, from 1980 into 1981.
He was the scariest criminal I ever came across. You could see it in his eyes. He just had that stare in his eyes, 1,000-yard look. He was just ruthless. He was just ruthless.
On Tuesday, hours after Bulger's death, Long showed us his personal stash of photos, documents, and notes from the investigation. Long says his team was finally closing in on Bulger when someone in law enforcement tipped him off, and the investigation was compromised.
They just knew they had the bases covered. And in the end, they thought they'd always hold that ace that they were informants for the FBI.
That was in 1981. But 32 years later, all of the work Long's team did finally paid off at Bulger's federal trial. Their work was used as evidence, and Long was the first person to testify. Long says the hardest part of the investigation being compromised is knowing that 9 people were murdered after Bulger got away.
But those families, they still have to live with it. They don't have their loved one around anymore.
But for Long, who wanted Bulger sentenced to death instead of life in prison, this is the day he can finally close the Bulger chapter of his life, after almost 4 decades.
This is the case that just wouldn't go away. Now it's gone. It's gone.
Jessica Reyes, Boston 25 News.
It is hard to imagine the torture and pain Whitey Bulger put his victims' families through. Michael Donahue was a Boston native who was an innocent bystander shot in the head and killed by Bulger in 1982. Boston 25 News reporter Ted Daniels spoke with Donahue's family. They say there won't be any tears shed in the Donahue household over Whitey's death.
I just want to get a bottle of champagne and pop that cork.
It's not the typical reaction to a death, but there's nothing typical about James Whitey Bulger or what he did to Patricia Donahue and her family.
He ruins my life, definitely, you know. I could never forgive him for that.
In May of 1982, Patricia's husband Michael was at a bar in the Seaport when a man named Brian Halloran asked him for a ride home. What Michael Donahue didn't know was that Halloran was an informant who Bulger wanted dead.
They went outside of the bar. When they went outside of the bar, they got in the car as they continued to pull out. Whitey Bulger and a couple of his colleagues pulled up next to him and shot and killed them both.
Tommy Donahue was just 8 years old when his dad was killed. He attended every day of Bulger's 2013 trial and many of the hearings that led up to it. The Donahues know the pain Bulger inflicted on so many families, and there's not an ounce of sympathy here.
I was overwhelmed with joy. I was very pleased to hear that he was dead.
I'm Ted Daniel, Boston 25 News.
This has been a Boston 25 News special report.
We'll continue to follow the investigation into Bulger's death, and you can find more on our website, boston25news.com. Thank you for joining us.